This happened to a friend and me a few years ago during the summer after our first year of college. We had both been talking about wanting to do something different that broke the routine, something away from screens and people and all the usual noise. So when he suggested a hiking trip into a national park a few states away, it sounded like exactly what we needed at the time. Neither of us was an expert hiker or anything close to that, but we figured if we stuck to the marked trails and kept our phones charged, there wasn't much that could go wrong. The park we chose was one of those huge forested areas where you can drive for miles before even reaching the main hiking entrances. By the time we actually parked and gathered our gear, it already felt like we were stepping into a completely different world. There were no buildings in sight, no traffic, nothing except trees stretching in every direction, and a silence that felt heavier than anything I was used to. Still, at that point, it felt more exciting than anything else. We started our hike mid-morning, following one of the longer trails that looped deeper into the forest before circling back toward the campground area where we planned to stay that night. For the first few hours, everything felt normal. We talked, took pictures, and joked about how we were probably overthinking how remote everything felt. The trail itself was clear and well marked, and we even passed a couple of other small groups heading in the opposite direction, so there was always this reassurance that we weren't completely isolated. But as the afternoon started to fade, and the sun shifted lower through the trees, the atmosphere around us began to change in a way I can't really describe properly. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Just small things, like the forest becoming quieter, the air feeling a little colder, and the shadows between the trees starting to look deeper than they should have. We decided it was probably a good idea to start heading back, since we didn't want to get caught too far out after dark. That's when things started to go wrong. At some point during our return, we must have missed a turn on the main trail. It wasn't clear how it happened. One moment we were following familiar markers, and the next, the path just didn't feel right anymore. The signs became less frequent, the trail narrowed, and the GPS on our phones started acting strangely, switching between signals and dropping location accuracy. It still showed we were somewhere inside the park boundaries, but it stopped matching anything around us. We stopped for a moment to figure out what to do, and that's when we heard it. At first, it sounded like someone calling out from deeper in the forest. A voice, faint, but definitely human. We both went quiet immediately, listening more carefully, thinking maybe another hiker was lost or in trouble. It came again a few seconds later, clearer this time, and what made it uncomfortable almost instantly was that it wasn't just random shouting. It sounded like someone was actually calling names. Not just any names either. It sounded like ours. My friend looked at me, and I remember the exact expression on his face because it matched how I felt. Confusion at first, then that slow shift into discomfort when your brain starts trying to explain something it can't quite accept. We both assumed it had to be some kind of coincidence, maybe other hikers nearby who somehow sounded closer than they were. So, against my better judgment, we started moving toward where the voice seemed to be coming from. The deeper we went, the stranger it became. The voice didn't stay in one place. It shifted constantly. Sometimes it sounded like it was just behind a cluster of trees. Sometimes it felt like it was far ahead of us. And sometimes it almost seemed to come from directly beside us, which made no sense because there was nothing there except thick forest. The more we followed it, the less certain I became that we were actually getting closer to anything. The trees around us also began to feel different, almost too dense, like they were closing in just slightly with every minute. The trail we thought we were following eventually disappeared entirely, replaced by uneven ground covered in dead leaves and roots, making it hard to walk without tripping. I remember checking my phone again and realizing the GPS had stopped working completely. That's when we finally stopped following the voice. We stood there for a moment trying to decide what to do, and the strange thing was that once we stopped moving, the voice stopped too. The forest went completely silent again, like whatever was calling us had also realized we weren't going to follow anymore. That silence felt worse than the voice itself. We turned around and started heading back the way we thought we came from, but nothing looked familiar anymore. Every direction looked the same, and the deeper sense of being lost began to set in. We walked for what felt like a long time before we finally stumbled back onto a marked trail, and I still remember the relief of seeing one of those small wooden signs pointing toward the main campground area. We didn't stop until we made it back. Later that night at the campsite, we told ourselves it was just some weird echo effect in the forest, maybe other hikers messing around or sound carrying in strange ways. But the park ranger we mentioned it to the next morning didn't really react the way we expected. He just listened quietly, then told us that the section of the forest we were in doesn't usually get lost hikers because the trail layout is pretty straightforward, and in all the years he had worked there, he had never heard anyone describe voices that specifically matched their location like that. We left the park the same day, and even now, years later, there's still one detail that neither of us has ever been able to explain properly. Every time we talk about it, we both remember the same thing. The voice didn't just sound like it was calling into the forest in general. It sounded like it already knew exactly where we were standing every single time it called our names. Story 2. The campsite that was already occupied. This happened a few years ago when I decided to take a solo trip to a national park after going through a pretty rough time in my life. I wasn't trying to do anything extreme or adventurous. I just wanted a few days away from everything. No work, no phone calls, no responsibilities. Just somewhere quiet, where I could clear my head. I booked a designated campsite in advance through the park's official system. It was one of the more isolated spots, which is exactly what I wanted at the time. According to the map, it was about a 20-minute drive from the main ranger station, followed by a short walk from the parking area. Nothing complicated. I reached the park in the late afternoon. The sun was already starting to drop behind the trees, casting long shadows across the road as I drove deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more it felt like I was leaving everything familiar behind. No phone signal, no other cars, just the sound of gravel under my tires and trees on both sides of the road. By the time I reached the parking area for my campsite, it was already getting close to evening. There wasn't anyone around. No other hikers, no campers, no rangers, just empty space and silence. I grabbed my backpack and started walking down the small trail that led to my assigned site. That's when I first noticed something felt slightly off. The campsite wasn't empty. At least, it didn't look empty. There was a fire pit in the center, and the ashes inside weren't cold. They looked fresh enough that I could still see faint heat distortion rising from them. A couple of logs were placed around it, as if someone had been sitting there not too long ago. One of the metal chairs was slightly turned, as it had just been pushed back. I remember just standing there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Because according to my reservation, this site was supposed to be mine alone, and it wasn't like it was a shared area. The ranger at check-in had specifically told me this was one of the more private, single booking sites. At first, I thought maybe someone had made a mistake. Maybe another camper had wandered in or set up temporarily without realizing it was reserved. It didn't feel dangerous yet, just confusing. I called out once, just in case someone was still there. No response. So, I did what I probably shouldn't have done. I stepped further in. The tent I had brought with me was still in my backpack, but I noticed something else immediately. There were faint impressions in the dirt around the site, like footprints made recently. Not deep enough to look old, not washed away by weather, fresh enough that I could still make out the shape clearly. What made it worse was that they didn't look like someone arriving or leaving. They looked like someone had been circling the campsite, slowly, more than once. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe park staff had been here earlier. Maybe another camper passed through. But the longer I stood there, the more that explanation started to fall apart, because nothing about it looked like someone passing through. It looked like someone was staying. Still, I didn't have anywhere else to go, and the nearest ranger station was too far to walk back before dark. So I decided to set up my tent anyway, trying not to think too much about what I had just seen. As night started to fall, the forest around me changed completely. During the day, it had felt peaceful. At night, it felt like it was paying attention. There was no wind at all, which made the silence even heavier. Every sound I made while setting up the tent felt louder than it should have. The zip of the bag, the snap of the tent poles, even my footsteps on the dirt. I tried to distract myself by making a small fire, but even that didn't help much. The darkness beyond the firelight felt too close, like it wasn't just surrounding me, but slowly shrinking inward. A few hours passed like that. Nothing happened. No movement, no voices, nothing obvious. But that almost made it worse, because I kept expecting something to happen, and it never did. Then I started hearing footsteps. Not loud, not fast. Just slow, steady movement around the campsite. At first, I thought it was just animals. That's what I told myself. But the pattern didn't feel random. It felt controlled. Like something was walking in a circle, staying just outside the edge of my firelight. Every time I turned the flashlight toward the sound, there was nothing there, just trees. Still, after a while, I became certain I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps never rushed. They never stopped completely. They just kept moving, always just far enough that I couldn't see anything clearly. I stayed inside the tent for most of the night after that. I didn't sleep. I just sat there listening, waiting for something I couldn't define. And then, just before sunrise, everything went quiet. Completely quiet. That silence made me think maybe it was finally over. Maybe whatever I was hearing was just my mind playing tricks on me in an unfamiliar place. So I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. That's when I saw it clearly. The footprints were back. But this time, they were closer to the tent than before. Much closer. Not scattered around the campsite anymore, but focused in one direction, leading straight toward where I had been sleeping. And the strange part was that there were no prints leading away. I didn't pack slowly after that. I left everything except my backpack and car keys. I didn't even look back properly when I reached the parking area. When I reported it at the ranger station, they checked the booking records again. According to them, the site had been marked as occupied the entire time. Not by me, by someone else. Someone whose name they said shouldn't have been in the system at all. I never went camping alone again after that.